welcome to Destiny Massive Breakdowns, episode 302. I'm Flash, and today we have an incredibly special final episode of Destiny Massive Breakdowns for you all. The final episode, I can't believe it. A Bungie developer interview with the original host of the show, Mercules Kyt Kutcha. Big thanks to Bungie for allowing them to come join us today. I'm so freaking stoked we get to do this. As most of you know, Podcast vs. Enemies, our PvE show under the Destiny Massive Breakdowns umbrella, will be taking over as the flagship DMB podcast. So, in light of that, I've also got one of the hosts of that show with me today, Impetus. Thank you for joining me this week for this very special interview.
Well, thank you, Lego. It is a pleasure to be here with the new and old hosts of a show that's honestly kept me invested in Destiny far more than I ever expected. I started listening to DMB, right after Beyond Light expansion launched, mostly to learn more about the weapon roles that I should be keeping for PvP, because I didn't know anything about that side of the sandbox, but 3 years later, I'm making a show for Destiny Massive Breakdowns. It goes without saying that I'm extremely honored to be here, both as a longtime listener and as a representative of Podcast vs. Enemies, so thank you.
Well, I'm excited to have you here because I think we're going to approach a few PvE things here, and I'm going to need your help for it because my mind has definitely been wrapped up in PvP. So we're going to jump straight into it, as celebrating the Destiny Massive Breakdowns podcast with this Bungie interview is the sole purpose of this episode. You know where you can find us: Impetus over on Podcast vs. Enemies, and me, Flash, over on YouTube. This episode is about Merc, Kit, Destiny the game, and the questions you have all asked as a community. So, Kyt Kutcha, Mercules, welcome back to Destiny Massive Breakdowns.
Dude, super stoked to be back. It's crazy that this show has come to an end, right? But it's even crazier to me that it went on for as long as it did. I think you guys crossed 300 episodes a little while back, which is wild to me. It's awesome that the show has been, such a big part of the community. When Kutch and I started, I don't think we ever had any idea that it was going to end up being what it became. So it's really emotional. It's really cool for me to be able to come back on the final episode and kind of talk to you guys from the other side a little bit.
Yeah, I want to echo those sentiments as well. And obviously this is my first opportunity to be speaking from the other side of the fence, so to speak. So I'm really excited, a little bit nervous, but just kind of pumped to be back and to kind of share this special episode with everybody. When we started doing this, what is it, like 7 years ago at this point, and I was like recording in my garage, like hanging a blanket up on the wall to try to cut down on the echo, which did not help. We had no idea what we were doing or where this was all going to go or any of the things that have happened. It's been just a crazy ride over the years, hitting some conventions and talking to all kinds of people in the community and at Bungie and just, man, what a crazy thing. And then, bringing on PvE, you guys just delivering an awesome show. I learn a ton from listening to PvE. And then Lego, you and Tony taking the reins on Massive Breakdowns and just delivering an awesome PvP focused experience. Like, it's been crazy. So yeah, I'm rambling now, so I'm gonna hand the mic back, but I'm really happy to be here.
I'm getting emotional just listening to y'all. Like I'm like secondhand emotion right now because like a part of this involves me, but the time that I've spent here is so short in comparison to the podcast that y'all created and are now working for the company the show was over. Is just insane. And it's insane that Bungie let y'all come on here. Thank you, Bungie, for allowing this to happen. This is crazy, and what a perfect ending to the show. And I'm sad to even say ending, but it lives on in other ways. But this is a very cool episode. Thank y'all for being here. So let's start with just introducing both of you semi more professionally and letting you say a bit about what you do at Bungie. Merc, let's start with you because everybody pretty much knows you, but just in case.
Yeah, well, my name is Mercules, obviously. I'm an associate weapons designer at Bungie. What that means is I work on pretty much everything that the weapons touch, right? So designing legendary perks, making legendary weapons, building exotic weapons, doing weapon tuning and balancing stuff like that, even picking which weapons we're going to build for a season, which was a job I had for season 22. So that was pretty exciting. I'm really stoked for that to come out. I've been on podcasts before. I'm sure you guys have heard me introduce myself a whole bunch of times. So I'll throw it back over to y'all.
Okay. And then Kit, you're up next.
Yeah, so I am a contract generalist tester on the QA team at Bungie. That doesn't really tell you a whole lot about what I do, but it actually also says more than you think. So I predominantly work on seasonal activities testing. So that is, for example, things like deep dives and Wicked Implement. I also help out as needed with a whole bunch of different areas in the test world. So that includes live bugs, general functionality testing, quests, and kind of the player journey through the season. Strings, which are all the words you see for the non-code, non-technical people out there. That's what a string is if you're in the coding world.
I appreciate it.
Yeah, it's one of those things where I came on and somebody said, okay, we got to look at string bugs. And I knew instantly what they were talking about. And only later did it occur to me that that's a privileged knowledge that comes from looking at code for way too long. But yeah, kind of so on, et cetera, all of the different things that go on during the season. At some point, I've probably looked at some aspect of it. Generalist really does very much sort of describe my title. If there's a bug and they need a body to investigate, that's what I'm there to help out with.
Yeah, well, before we jump into the big questions here, I want to, since you're the newbie here, Kit, in a manner of speaking, I mean, it's funny because you've been here forever, but also you're on the other side now. We did have a few questions. I will say, before I jump into that, I want to clarify that the questions today are directed at the areas of the game Kit and Merc can talk about, given their positions, so weapon tuning and QA testing. And so we're going to only focus on those. And these questions weren't just made up by us here now. They've been gathered from the Destiny Master Breakdowns community and social media, with maybe one or two sprinkled in from myself, which hopefully we'll get to. Starting off, though, before we get to the major big hitter questions, I want to ask, what's it been like at Bungie for you, Kit? How has some of the questions we got here has being a part of the team and seeing behind the curtain and now being an employee impacted the way you interact with the game or community?
Yeah, so that's a great question. Obviously being on the other side, seeing how the sausage is made, as I think somebody said at one point, it's a crazy experience. Obviously, as I think people have in the Massive Breakdowns community have noticed, I've drawn back pretty heavily from talking to the community at large. Obviously, that's something I was previously doing a lot of. Various reasons for that, but the biggest one is just that I know too much now, and the best way to not give stuff away is to say nothing at all. So if I'm playing, I might ask somebody, what do you think about this? But I'm not going to tell you what I think about that. So I also have to be aware too that anything I say could be taken out of context or as more than my own opinion. And so that's why, if you find me on social media, you'll find me talking about Star Wars or Marvel or fitness, basically anything but Destiny.
Oh, nice. We need to talk Marvel soon, is what I gathered from that.
Marvel Massive Breakdowns.
Yeah.
Rolls off the tongue.
What's another question we got here was, what's your favorite daily thing you do while working on the team? Anything you're particularly proud of or that you accomplished or did while on the team? Where can we find your work in the game, basically?
Yeah, so this is kind of a bunch of questions all sort of rolled into one, but I'll answer them one at a time. So I think probably my favorite daily thing that I do, this is one of the first things I do every day, is I fire up the latest version of Destiny and just spend some time getting a feel for what's new. So I kind of have my own little daily this version in Destiny, where I can read up on the latest changes, go take a look at what's been changed. I'm trying to speak very generally here. It is. So I'd say my favorite thing is probably that. But on the other hand, our test group chat is real good at the memes, man. The meme game inside Bungie is strong.
Ooh.
So I really enjoy being a part of that as well.
That's got to be something crazy to wake up at, not just the memes, that's crazy too, but to wake up and play a new version of Destiny. Like, it's just, I can't imagine what that's like on the other side.
Yeah, it's pretty surreal sometimes when I actually stop and think about the fact that like every day, sometimes twice a day, I'm installing a new version of the game. Sometimes versions for different releases. In any given week, I'm probably playing, 8 to 9 different versions of the game, probably for 2 to 3 different releases. And so it's pretty cool. It's also just a ton of fun hanging out, interacting with, learning from all the really smart people involved in making Destiny, right? There's a ton of really smart people, and I've learned a lot about QA, a lot about the game industry, a lot about what goes into making the game. And so that's been a lot of fun. In terms of things I'm proud of or accomplished while on the team, so many things I can't talk about right there. However, what I can say is that I did spend a lot of time working on deep dives and the exotic mission, and I'm extremely proud of what we were able to accomplish with both of those things. Fantastic team involved. The whole team was super smart, super fun to work with. Very, very good at their jobs, and really, we had a great time making what I think was some really great Destiny content. So you'll find some of my work in deep dives, and not just my work, of course, but the work of a whole host of people. But yeah, the kind of things that I contributed to. I want to be really clear here. I'm not taking sole responsibility. Teams are stronger than heroes, right? That's a Bungie Bungie mantra, and it's super true. But if I had to pick one thing that I feel like I had a personal hand in, I'd say my proudest achievement was really pushing hard to make sure that we kept the difficulty level and the ad density for deep dives high.
Yeah.
I spent hours and hours crafting and abusing the most broken builds I could find, whether I was making them myself or stealing them from you guys, stealing them from, people on YouTube and out there in the community. My goal with that was really just to test the activity balance and to push hard to make sure that like we knew where it was at and that good players were going to be challenged when they got down to the abyss and along the way, those pressure trials as well. And that was not something that really I didn't like. I say I pushed hard. There wasn't a lot of pushback on that. The design team was super on board to keep things challenging. Really what I did is just try to find as many opportunities as I could to encourage people to use cracked builds in our playtests. And I think it went well.
Nice, yeah.
Impetus, I'll let you tell me what you think about it.
That's what I was going to say, yeah.
Oh boy. No, it was really exciting to kind of get into this kind of activity for the first time. And yeah, the different layers going deeper and deeper, also seeing that little message on the side of the screen saying that the reward tier was going up and up, right? Like, okay, right. All right, let's get to time 7 here we go, come on. Yeah, it was fun. Definitely a different kind of seasonal activity. Greatly appreciated. Had a lot of fun running it with Court and St. Kabir, that's for sure.
Yeah, I'm super impressed with the activity as a whole. Like, even from a PvP side, is just a blast to have something so different. And that must have been cool experience for you, because it's a very different kind of Destiny activity. We've never had anything quite like it that was kind of exploratory at first and then, gets more ad heavy as it goes. So very cool experience. Impetus, I'm going to let you take the next few questions. We've got some PvE weapon tuning specific questions here, and I'm just going to let you take it away.
My pleasure. Absolutely. Let's get into it. So question here, I think this is definitely a topic that's been on the PvE focused community's mind for a while now, is the PvE special meta, the use of double special weapons, and then of course the general prevalence of special weapons intended. And if it is not intended, will it be tuned in the future?
It's not intended, and we are doing a little bit of tuning in Season 22. I'm sure that many of you are aware that when you run double special, it seems like the prevalence of heavy ammo drops is greatly increased. And that is actually true. You numerically get way more heavy ammo when you run double special. That is because of a bug that was introduced unseen back when we made the swap to unlimited primary weapon ammo. And so that's actually been around for quite some time. And I think it's only really started to take off and like get a lot of notice recently. So we have fixed that bug in season 22. So you're no longer going to get increased heavy ammo when you're running double special. As of right now, we are not directly going to nerf double special, but we are keeping a very tight eye on it. You know, there is some thought that a double special is interesting when it's run with things like a trace rifle or like Forerunner, right? Which are very specifically like, they blend the lines of primary weapons and special weapons, right? Like they very specifically have a different ammo economy than something like a slug shotgun or a waveframe grenade launcher. And so I think that there is some interest there, that it feels like weapons like trace rifles have a purpose and have, you know, a point to run them in PvE. However, the idea of players being able to run like a waveframe and a fusion rifle and literally never run out of ammo is definitely not something that we want to be the preferred or the best way to play in-game PvE content. So like I said, we're monitoring it going into season 22. We want to see what change the reduced heavy drops has on it. I would imagine that it's still going to be a pretty popular build style. But yeah, I would expect it to be something that we keep an eye on for the future.
Sure. Well, speaking of a special weapon class, I'd love to hear your thoughts.
I actually want to jump in real quick if I can, just to kind of chime in from the testing side, talking about double special. We do a lot of testing in PvE activities with, you know, as I mentioned before, with known good loadouts, right? Like it's not just what we think is the best. We're looking at what are the best players using, and we're testing with that. You know, I personally love running double special loadouts to see how activities handle them. I'm not the only one. And so it is something that the activity design teams are also well aware of as a phenomenon. I can definitely assure you guys of that because I'm telling them. And like I said, I'm not the only one doing it. So
that's
nice.
Good to know. Yeah, I wanted to know kind of our studio's thoughts on the state of sniper rifles in PvE. They've been getting buffs, kind of very slow incremental buffs over the last few seasons. What is the philosophy or the intended role behind them? So, for example, are they intended to be used against champs and majors, or is the design leaning them more towards bosses, mini bosses, and I guess most importantly, do you feel like they're underperforming in the eyes of the weapons team?
I think we can probably safely say that they're underperforming a bit. There's a reason that we've been pretty slow to like move snipers upwards, and it's because we've talked about this on the other shows, but basically you have a weapon class that has functionally unlimited range, right? And the second snipers become the best for something, it invalidates a lot of other things in the sandbox very quickly. And so we're kind of taking slow steps upwards to make sure that we don't just boost them past everything else and then, you know, kind of massively upset the balance and make it to where snipers are really the only thing that you need to run. So we're being careful about that. I think they're still, even after the most recent like 10% damage buff, I think they're still underperforming a little bit. So we're probably going to take another pass at them. I don't think we have anything in season 22, but I would expect in a future season we will. I think the intended purpose that we look at for special weapons is that they are primarily like burst damage, right? So that would be something you would use them against orange bars, you'd use them against champs, you'd use them on short damage phases, stuff like that. Snipers obviously have the capacity to deal pretty decent sustained damage as well. And that's another reason why we have to be careful with them, because I know that people think of Darcy and Whisper and they're like, oh, those are heavy snipers, right? But they're still based on normal snipers. And if we focus too heavily and we buff snipers up, well, we end up with the special weapons that outclass heavy weapons, right? And we're going to talk about that a little bit later when we talk about glaives as well, and why we touch builds like Syntheseps and stuff like that. But like one thing that we really do want to avoid is we want to avoid special weapons outclassing heavy weapons in terms of just like raw available damage.
And just to add to that again, you know, looking at things from the activities testing perspective, one of the things that we're often asked to look at when we're testing a new activity or a new encounter is, can players hide far away with long range weapons and pick off enemies in relative safety? Right. So that's not just snipers, but it's also scouts and other long range weapons. And that's always an important question for the activity designers to ask, because, in general, when that's an option, it's something that they want to have specifically planned to be an option. When it's not an option, it's because it would trivialize the encounter, right? If you can just sit in the back and blink away, sort of, why are we even here?
I remember with the first few times I was running deep dives, when you get to the final boss room, you're jumping down from that platform far above where you go and put up your rally banner, and that it was like the second or third time I was getting to the boss room. I thought, hey, wait a minute, can I just stand up here and swap to a sniper rifle? But no, you guys have thought of that. I got to get teleported down and actually get in the midst of all those enemies. So I completely understand that sentiment.
Well, I think there are some other questions about that kind of thing later. We can talk about that a little more, but yes.
Yeah. Pardon the pun here. I did not write this question, but what is the impetus behind making inventory size influenced by mag size, and why does the influence pattern vary by weapon type? Do you have any hints about how it works? So, for example, machine guns and linear fusion rifles seem to function on how much rounding there is on the magazine size, and do you have any plans to surface the reserves for weapons in-game, given how consequential it can be?
So you were asking about like the deep magic, the old magic here. We did poke around and we did look, and from what we understand, the general idea was that when inventory size was fixed, because magazine sizes are so variable, you would get into these weird states where you would have a huge magazine and like a very tiny inventory. And so they thought that it felt weird to have a magazine size of like 100 and that potentially be like only a half a magazine in inventory, right? So the decision was made to scale, basically use a multiplier and like run a calculation in the back end. And as your magazine size increases, then your inventory can also increase somewhat proportionally with it, so that you don't run into those situations, right? As far as surfacing it in game, because it's not like a fixed stat, because it is literally a calculation that runs live, it is very difficult for us to surface like that. And there's a lot of custom work that has to go in. It is something we're actually actively investigating doing, because we want to do it because, like you said, seeing your available inventory, and especially the effects that like mods and stuff and perks have on it, is like super, super important for selecting a weapon for PvE. But when we looked at it, it wasn't like the other hidden stats that we could kind of do a moderate amount of work and then some UI work and like surface them. It's like this whole other thing that we have to kind of like pick up and move very carefully and then like tuck behind the scenes and like wrap it in a UI. And so we were like, oh, that's very risky and an awful lot. So like I said, we are investigating it. It's something we would love to do, but I'm not going to tell you that's happening in the next couple seasons.
Gotcha. All right, a big question here. Are you going to buff any other legendary primary weapons in PvE? We know about the hand cannon buffs, but what about auto rifles, pulse rifles, sidearms, etc.?
So we are buffing hand cannons, as you said. The buff that they're getting in Season 22 is a pretty substantial one. In Season 23, we're testing a damage buff for pulse rifles. I want to say it's about like, I don't know, 10 to 15%, somewhere around there, damage to get them up to where we want them to be. If that goes well, we'll probably try to move that forward into mid-season 22, which I would expect it to. As far as sidearms are actually like kind of cracked, and it is more just how dangerous it is to get in close and like high-end content that is keeping them back. And there's not really anything we can do about that because they do insane amounts of damage right now. Scout rifles, we're not going to buff scout rifles anymore anytime soon because of the same thing we talked about with sniper rifles, right? Like we don't want the most effective strategy to be you sitting in the back and just like plinking away at something, especially with a weapon that has unlimited ammo, right? And you may have seen a note in the patch notes about bows as well, where we erroneously said that we were changing the damage fall off of bows. Well, the reason bows don't have damage fall off is because there was an issue that prevented them from being hit scan at long range. Especially lightweights. I'm sure people have noticed that the hit registration on them is very weird. And we were actually able to fix that issue in Season 22. And so we preemptively set bows up to have damage fall off, but we have not enabled it. We're going to kind of wait and see how they feel now that they should have significantly improved hit registration at longer range. But we did preemptively set that. We can kind of, so to speak, like flip a switch and turn it on if we need to, if it becomes a balance problem. But auto rifles are interesting. We're going to let hand cannons go out, and we're going to let pulses go out, and we're going to see how the primary weapon sandbox settles, especially after the heavy ammo drops for double special weapons, and then we'll reevaluate. But like I do have to say something here, and I don't know that we have ever said this as a team publicly, but like there have been a lot of cries for like, oh, I just want my hand cannons to be able to like one tap in a Grandmaster. And like I am telling you now that like that is never going to happen. We are not going to let hand cannons one tap in a Grandmaster. We on the weapons team balance around what we call the base sandbox, right? And the base sandbox is like heroic nightfalls, legendary campaigns, stuff like that, right? Anything easier than that, you're going to feel a little bit overpowered. Anything harder than that, you're going to start feeling underpowered. The reason why we're not going to allow stuff to one tap red bars in a GM is because it leads to what's called an arms race, right? So because we balance for the base sandbox, the weapons are balanced there. An activity designer builds an activity and they say, I want it to be this difficult. And they scale like the delta of the combatants up to make it as difficult as they want. If we balance for a GM and we make it to where hand cans can one tap in a GM, right? That suddenly makes that content significantly easier. And then what does the activity designer do? The next time they come around, they're like, oh, this feels too easy. And they scale the activity up, right? And then we constantly get stuck in this cycle that, again, we called it the arms race, where we scale weapons power up to meet the in-game activity. And then the in-game activity designer scales the activity up to outstrip the weapons. And that process continues on and on and on. And we end up a little bit, so to speak, where we're at now, where people are like, oh, we want you to revert back to the Shadow Keep, precision damage model that you had. And it's like, if we were to do that, you guys are already on a lot of weapons dealing more precision damage than you dealt in Shadow Keep. And you're also, in most cases, dealing double body shot damage than you were. Reverting back to Shadow Keep's damage model would be a huge nerf for almost every gun, right? It is that the sandbox has grown. Right. And as the sandbox grows, then weapons have to grow. And so we have kind of made a decision that we are going to, stop that here. And so we look at GMs, like we don't disregard them. We go into GMs and we test all the weapons and we test all the changes and we make sure nothing's out of band in GM compared to other weapons, right? But what we're really balancing for is the base sandbox, which is those middle, slightly above middle difficulty activities, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
Yeah, so I was going to add some stuff here from the activities testing perspective, but Merc kind of said a lot of what I was going to say, so I'll just echo it a little bit. But when we're testing an activity, one of the things that we always look at is what's the target difficulty tier for this activity? What are our sort of our baselines? What are our comparisons? And a lot of times we'll go and we'll play the baselines to sort of get fresh in our heads. What's the right feel? And then we'll play the activity and say, okay, does this feel comparable? Because it's never a precise measure, right? Because every activity is different in terms of mechanics, the objectives, enemy composition, bosses, the layout of the level. So ultimately, we're always working by feel. But like Merc said, if legendary primaries are getting too strong, if my hand cannon is one tapping, and it's say I'm in Abyss and deep dives. And I'm just one tapping everything. I'm going to be like, hey, this is way too easy. And then, of course, like you said, we end up, going into a lot of meaningless back and forth power creep. And it's just all sort of like, okay. So that is, again, just echoing. That's why the designers on both sides are always thinking about the core game. And that's where, as testers, that's what we're thinking about, too. We're looking at,
nice.
Let's go back and, what in the core game is our touchstone in terms of difficulty.
Yeah. And when you look at stuff like raids, right? Like a lot of times outside of contest mode, raids aren't designed for the ads to be like super tanky, right? Like ads are more tanky in Grandmasters than they are in raids a lot of the time, or in dungeons. And the reason that is because raids and dungeons a lot of times have mechanical aspects to them too. And so if you were having to deal with Grandmaster level combatants and also the mechanical aspects of the raid or dungeon, it'd be an extremely difficult activity to do. And a lot of times it's kind of more how contest modes fields and stuff like that, or like master raids, right? But those are elective. Mm-hmm. So if we were to start tuning everything for those upper tier elective difficulties, that would make the lower tier elective difficulties like far, far too easy, right? Like ads would just melt before you and everything like that. So there's a reason why we balance around that like upper middle part of the sandbox, because then it gives us a nice variety of things that are easier, things that are middle, things that are harder. And like the intent is that as you leave that part and you start getting into master content and grandmaster content, that it should feel more difficult and your weapon should feel a little bit weaker. And if you don't enjoy that feel, if you don't enjoy your weapons being weak, that's a valid criticism of, you know, the activity from your perspective and from your opinion, right? But it is not a valid response for us to suddenly make a huge jump in power, which then starts the process all over again, and we end up right back where we were.
Mm-hmm. Right. You could say that deep dives or the new exotic mission are, you don't like the way that they feel difficulty-wise, but like it gives you that scaling of, you know, you can give that feedback, but it's not like you're going to continually balance the game around these more difficult activities, because then the other activities are just meaningless and the entire game feels the same.
And one of the things that like I think would help the community a lot is to like kind of hear the way that like we give feedback internally and utilize it, because so much of the feedback that we get from the community is not exactly the most useful feedback because of the way it's phrased, which is like, fuck this activity, I hate this, right?
Yeah.
And it's like, okay, well, we know that there's a negative feeling about this activity, but that doesn't actually help us to understand what the issue is with the activity. Saying, I don't enjoy this activity, my weapons feel too weak. I would prefer if AI felt smarter, or bosses had more health, like, you know, or there were more enemies, right? Like, that is totally valid criticism to provide, is that like, how this thing made me feel and why I think I felt that way, and an example of something that I may have preferred, right? If you give feedback in that way, that's not necessarily telling the designer or the developer, you have to do this thing, right? It's just, I didn't particularly enjoy this. Here's the reason why I don't think I enjoyed it. I think I may have enjoyed it more if it was like this.
Yeah.
Right. And when you get feedback that way in a respectful manner, it's so much more useful to us than just like, I hate this thing sucks. Right. So there are some people in the community, content creators and just normal people aside, that I see on Reddit who do a really fantastic job of giving that feedback. And a lot of times when we see stuff like that, like it gets acted upon, like we internalize it, and we'll share Reddit threads around, and we'll share YouTube videos that we see or clips from streams and be like, hey, this was something really salient. Like, I think that we should open a discussion about this. Right. But the stream of tweets that are just like, man, this thing sucks, you guys should be fired. Like, you know, I understand venting your frustration, but we can't really do anything about that. And it just makes people want to like disconnect from that source, which is, you know, it's cutting off your nose to spite your face, basically.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Before we go into the exotic mission, I did just want to clarify, because you did make a big point there about the weapons team view on the strength of primaries. So when you're talking about a hypothetical meta where hand cannons can one-shot, you're talking about at the base level, right? No damage perks, no modifiers, right? You don't want at the base level of a hand cannon to one-tap in a GM. Is that right, Merc?
Correct. Like, I don't want you to be able to go in with like, you know, a Vulpecula or something, or you know, just an Exalted Truth with nothing on it, and just be like one tapping, you know, dregs and thralls and stuff like that, right? Like, if you build into it, if you've got your surges going on, and you've got, you know, a minor spec mod, and you've got kill clip up, then, you know, whatever, knock yourself out. Like, that's why we have that stuff available for you to be able to increase your power, right? But I'm talking about, like, I don't want you just dropping into a GM. Sorry, we don't want you just dropping into a GM with no preparation, with no bonuses, with no anything, and you start melting Vandals like you're on patrol in the Cosmodrome, right?
I remember those days very fondly. All right, let's get into the exotic mission here for Wicked Implement. Had a very, very memorable boss. Just would not stand still with that bugger. My goodness, it was pitch black, and I can hear that thing groaning from across the map, and all of a sudden it's leaping up in the air, and then I'm suppressed. But no, honestly, truly, this is a really fun type of mission, and it was really great to play through this. How much buzz was there at Bungie when that Whetstone week finally hit, and the community was suddenly scrambling to uncover the secrets of how to even get into that special area, and then, of course, the rush to complete it.
Yeah, you know, funny thing, the Tormentor was asking us the same question about all of you. Guardians are always sliding under these walls. It's so annoying. No, it's really exciting to see something like this go live. This was the first time I've been able to be a part of that on the inside. Honestly, part of me is just relieved that the secret is out and we can acknowledge its existence now. Finally being able to talk about it outside of work is very much a relief. But the biggest thing is that, we share in the excitement of the players as they discover and explore this new thing. So many hours went into the making of it. And so it's a really exciting time to, be seeing people starting to talk about it. It takes a lot of work to create a hidden mission like this, and even more work for so many teams involved. There are so many teams involved in dropping the right clues at the right time to lead players on this journey, without giving everything away too early. So yeah, I'm going to take a second here, take an opportunity to just shout out some of the folks from the teams involved. Huge respect to all of them. Noah, the activity design lead for the mission, did a ton of work, of course. But big shout outs as well to Clayton, who was the lead on Deep Dives, Vea, who also did a ton of design work there. Corey on the investment side, Nico from narrative, Todd from World Art, Adam and Nadia on the sound team, Lucky and Kai, our test leads on the mission. These folks were all phenomenal, and there are so many more that I'm not going to name drop right now. I'd love to be able to shout out everybody, but that's what game credits are for, right? So, and then, even just beyond like the test team and the direct design teams, there are a dozen or more people on other teams who also did a ton of work to make this happen, but again, gonna try to keep it brief. But yeah, I just had the opportunity to give the credit where it deserves, which is to the entire team of people. And so I wanted to take that. Yeah, super, super pumped to watch everybody exploring.
I'm happy to hear that. It might be a little too early to talk about this, but I'm sure the community wants to know, will we see more activities like deep dives and hidden missions inside them in the future? Has that gone over well in the eyes of Bungie?
I guess you'll just have to wait and see.
Okay.
I talked to the design team. I did, kind of ask thoughts about this, and there's not a lot I can say, right, about any future content, whether that's something is or isn't going to happen. What I can say is that if they do something like this again, there will definitely be a lot that was learned from this effort carried forward into that. And that's kind of all I can really say on that front. What I can say generally about this type of mission is that every exotic mission like this is something that's really important to the whole team that's involved in it. When this is being built and when it's being tested, our goal is always to meet players with a really high level of quality for this mission. So like with Wicked Implement, I can kind of share some of the goals for design for Wicked Implement included, obviously surprising players. We wanted to pay off some of the mystery of the deep. Diving down was always sort of a mysterious experience. But we also wanted to make sure we were delivering on a really exciting arena and an encounter that was going to challenge players in terms of power, in terms of their actual, skill, and also just in terms of their minds and their ability to think under pressure. As a tester on this project, for me, I thought it was really important to make sure that players would encounter this mission with, sort of a sense of discovery. This doors opening up for them. And also that the tension and the challenge level as you progress would ratchet up. And then that, of course, that the final encounter delivers on all of that buildup. And the whole team was really happy with how this one came out. And so, we hope everybody enjoyed it as much as we did making it and testing it.
Cool. Loved it.
Yeah.
Probably like my favorite kind of activity in Destiny, like even outside of PvP, is just that discovery you were talking about. Oh, I had to, when I found out about it, I had to go in solo. Like, even though I couldn't get very far, obviously, my PvP self, but it's just such a great, iconic, at this point, experience within Destiny to have those moments. And it's cool to hear from the team and their goals personally just really line up for me what I'm looking for in the content. It's very fun.
Awesome. Glad to hear it.
GG's team.
Yeah, nothing like opening up Discord while I'm at work and hearing, there's a timer. It's a time mission. There's a timer. And speaking of the timer, I'm curious to know, how do you guys balance the kind of enemies that appear versus the enemy that is time, I suppose, since that is a harsh mechanic, a lethal mechanic? And do certain enemies lend themselves better to timed missions than others? Have you guys found through playtesting these kinds of activities?
Sure. These are some good questions. I have kind of a long answer for you here. So I was able to kind of go back and talk to the designers about their thoughts on this. So I'm going to share some of that, and then also just kind of some of the perspective from the testing side of things. So from a design philosophy perspective, what their goal was to create a dynamic where players are timed, but ultimately have a lot of agency on how quickly you complete the encounter. So in the current sandbox of Destiny, right, players are very strong. I don't think that's a controversial statement. Even when we increase the power delta of combatants, players are very strong. So the general feeling on the design team is that most enemy factions in Destiny are pretty equally suited to fit into a timed mission. They didn't choose the Taken because there was some kind of inherent advantage to using them in timed missions, if that's what the question is asking. Taken were the enemy of choice here, not because they made sense from a timer perspective, but because of the narrative of the season itself, right? It would have been pretty strange to be dealing with like Sloane's whole situation going on there, and then you go off and fight the Vex in an exotic mission, right? That would have been like, what's the through line here? So from a test perspective, enemy composition, though, is something that we do think about a lot. We give a lot of feedback on, what if we throw this enemy in? What if we throw that? More of this, less of that. The biggest thing that I personally thought about with that particular enemy set with the Taken is that the DPS phases that you got needed to not be something that was being overly interfered with by ads. Thinking about those Taken goblins specifically, because DPS was something that was being mechanically earned and also happening on a strict time limit within a time limit. So making sure that we didn't have Taken goblins throwing around invincibility, and that was something where you as a player had the opportunity to plan and execute. And also, of course, on the Minotaurs, right? If we'd had 100 Taken goblins throwing invincibility on the Minotaurs, that would have been very frustrating. But beyond that, like I said, this is kind of a big question. So one of the other things that I wanted to take this opportunity to share is that obviously deep dives is one of the first seasonal activities that is heavily making use of stacking power deltas as a difficulty mechanic. So players of Grandmasters and higher level Nightfalls, of course, are already pretty familiar with how power deltas work. And by now, I think, hopefully pretty much everybody playing Destiny has a good feel for that from playing deep dives. I hope everyone was able to dive in at this point. But for those that aren't familiar, of course, the short version is that essentially it's a tool for designers to set a baseline difficulty level. Merc kind of alluded to this earlier. So going into deep dives, there's a baseline difficulty for Twilight. And if your power's, too far down, it's going to be pretty hard, right? But it also being too high up is only going to benefit you so much. And so, Twilight's obviously the first level. And then after that, each level, that power delta, that difficulty increases. The pressure trials also ratchet up the difficulty as well. And this is actually kind of a big deal on the test side. This was very difficult to test because it was, really the first time that we're doing something like this. So there was a huge concern that difficulty could very easily skew too hard or too easy if we didn't get the balance right. So that was something that we spent a lot of time working on. We did a lot of play testing with fire teams of various skill levels to help support design and dialing in the right level of challenge. Big shout out to the community team for coming in and absolutely mopping the floor with us, making us look like casuals. But anyways, so we, that's kind of what we were thinking about. There's, hopefully that's illuminating for folks to hear.
Certainly. The last kind of aspect of this that I'd love to hear more about is how do you balance the encounter time versus the boss's health? And how do you achieve that certain level of difficulty with the timer, and how many damage phases it might factor into for fully killing the boss?
Yeah, so I asked Noah specifically about this as the lead, and I'm more or less gonna quote him here. But a lot of playtesting and tuning happened to determine a sweet spot for completing this encounter. Right, so that was something that was being thought about. Rough estimates were that we wanted the night boss to be defeated with around 8 to 7 minutes remaining on the clock, and then the tormentor to be defeated with under 90 seconds remaining. Those were kind of the rough targets. And then, the dynamic in the maze with the tormentor chasing you around while you're frantically collecting buffs necessitated that most of the time in the counter would happen in the actual maze. To kind of elaborate from like the testing side, this was a ton of fun to test, especially with somebody who hadn't played it before. But we did a lot of play testing on different variations on the boss's health, difficulty tier settings for the ads, because obviously that makes a big difference in there as well. The biggest stuff that we looked at in QA was figuring out the right level of difficulty for the enemies and the mechanics. Actually, we didn't have to worry as much about the boss, right? It was much more about like, can you execute the mechanics in a reasonable amount of time? Are the enemies too nuts that you can't even get to the DPS phase, right? Once we can get there, then we sort of are dialing that in. So there were a number of changes and a lot of discussion around DPS phase mechanics, especially with regards to where those Minotaurs spawned in, how much wandering they were doing around the maze. They were not very well behaved, but adding the marking to them resolved that issue. I'll also note that thread cutter buff was finicky is the word that I settled on. But poor Noah, there were definitely a few weeks in a row where he would fix a bug and we would find a new way to break it. So it's always fun, I think, working on something like this. But yeah, that's kind of a peek behind the curtain.
Well, I have to say, y'all really nailed the final, just altogether. Like you said, it's not just the final boss encounter. It's the time that you hit the middle boss. Like, it's every single section of it. And I had to play it 3 separate times. So I didn't have anyone on or anything. I just BNet, find a fire team. 3 different random teams couldn't do it, and 2, and then my third one, we finally nailed it, like right at the last few seconds.
Yeah.
And there's just nothing like that feeling to show. Like and the first run that we did, we barely didn't get it. It was just a sliver of health left, and that's kind of the experience it sounds like you're aiming for. So I feel like y'all just nailed it. All that testing really paid off. And follow up to that, because I kept using BNet find a fire team, but it is within a match made activity is how you can launch it. So one of the questions here is, what was the thought process behind putting the exotic mission inside a match made activity, and what were the concerns with that?
Yeah, that's a great question. So the Whetstone encounter was originally thought up as a spiritual successor of the Black Spindle mission from Destiny 1. So for those who may have forgotten, it has been a few rotations of the Traveler since then. Players had to reach an inconspicuous door by speeding through the heroic version of the story mission Lost to Light. And, so we were concerned about players not enjoying being kicked to orbit, or having to redo deep dives to access it. But on top of having to reach the actual door in Lost to Light within the time limit, players also had to wait in real time for the mission to be available to them. So it actually isn't that different from what was going on there in that sense. This was something where there was a lot of discussion about this on the test side in terms of how to make sure that it was fun and worthwhile in those conditions. Not to mention just that it worked at all. It's first question is, does this work? Right? We spent a lot of time looking not just at difficulty, but also at various griefing scenarios, and just trying to remove as much downside as possible from the matchmaking aspect in deep dives as a whole, not just for the exotic mission. Making sure that there's only so much we can do about what players are going to do ultimately. Ultimately, Destiny is a game you play with other people, and matchmaking in that regard, I think, was a huge upside for the activity. And the whole, the whole team, I say me, I mean, what I mean is the whole team, right? I'm not making that call, but ultimately, this was also an experience that all of the teams involved learned a lot from, as I mentioned before. And so those learnings are definitely going to be carried forward to, all of the future experiences that are created.
Nice.
Yeah, that's more or less the answer.
There you go. Wanted to ask a hyper-specific question here about confirmation on the catalyst to Wicked implement and the drop requirements for that. So can it drop from a normal deep dive, or does it have to be the tier 7 completion for the catalyst to drop?
Sure. So tier 7 deep dives is a guarantee.
Okay.
I can say that. However, it is still fairly likely to drop from slightly lower reward tiers. And that's all I can tell you on that front.
We will take that answer.
It's good for me to know. I don't have it yet, so.
Oh,
all right.
Like, we gotta run that. Come on,
I know.
Get that tier 7, man. Get that catalyst.
Absolutely.
Tier 7's worth it anyways.
Yeah.
You got to drag me out of PvP first. That's the main holdup. It's not the activity.
Okay. All right.
That's how I feel too.
Yeah, we know.
It's kind of funny that I'm looking at the like the 4 squares that we have, and it's like Lego and I are down on the bottom, and Impetus and Kutcha are up on the top. It's just like weird that it's paired up that way, because it's like
It is.
yeah, it's funny. There's like a 1-to-1, like replacement kind of for us. It's
Perfect.
It's pretty interesting. Yeah.
That is funny. Was it hard to get like a secret mission approved? We're not really sure how this works, of course, and we're wondering if you could shed some light on that. Are you worried that players will kind of come to expect these types of secret missions and they might lose that sense of mystery that does make them quite special?
So, I would say that a sense of mystery and the opportunity for players to uncover secrets like this is something that's central to the experience of Destiny. And so, no, I think worry is probably the wrong word to describe how the team feels about it. With this mission, we wanted to deliver something that would reward longtime fans with that sense of nostalgia, but also still be new and exciting and fresh for everyone who encountered it, whether you played Black Spindle or this is your first exotic mission in Destiny. I will say, in terms of like the whole getting it approved thing, and again, I talked to design about that process. And so we actually had resources allocated to the exotic counter in the beginning of Season 21. So there was always going to be an exotic encounter. And Noah actually is probably why he's the design lead, is the one who pitched the version that ended up shipping to kind of give it an increased size and scope and make it this special experience. So the team pushed really hard to get the Tormentor boss, the Pyramid palette, kind of all the things that made it really cool and special and kind of different. I think we're all very happy with how it turned out. And, honestly, we hope players are going to be open to getting excited about more secrets in Destiny in the future.
Nice.
I'm glad you brought up the Pyramid palette, because you got that time at the end of the mission to go run around and explore the labyrinth, and there's
right?
Some weird stuff that's going on in there. Can we ask what are the colors in the there's some colored statues, there's some, it looks like glass of some sort. What does that exactly mean, Kit?
Yeah. So it's funny, actually. You mentioned the time at the end that you guys get to explore. There's actually very briefly a bug where that time was infinite. And you also couldn't go to orbit, so that was fun. But
oh wow, well, prison
just stuck. So that we got that fixed pretty quick. But no, actually, what happened is that while testing inside of the maze encounter, people were consistently getting lost and losing their bearings because everything was the same. And so we ended up coloring each quadrant of the maze a different color so players could differentiate between them. And they also ended up raising and lowering sections to make them more distinct from each other so you could kind of tell where you were in the labyrinth.
I felt that.
And then, of course, one of the final usability adjustments was just to mark the Minotaurs after a certain period of time. And all of that was aimed at making the maze more navigable. Before that, we were always telling Noah, we can't find the Minotaurs. They wandered off and we don't know where we are. So, yeah, that's kind of where the colors came from.
That's a really creative solution. It makes it such a distinct space.
Yeah, the design folks are really smart,
You guys are good at your jobs, man. That's the end of our exotic mission questions here. So I think we're going to kind of broaden things, go on to just more general QA questions here. This is a very broad one here to kind of open things up with, but how many iterations of an idea do you typically work through with the dev team that designed the thing that you are testing?
So there's really no typical number, right? It's anywhere from 1 to dozens. Sometimes they nail it on the first go. It's just like perfect. And other things just don't work out the way that they are, especially, early concepts. And they'll end up morphing considerably or being replaced by something else or just cut. And we move on to focus on the things that are working. I think I've said it a few times. The activities design team is super smart, super creative. So one of the best things for me, and I think for a lot of people about doing QA on Destiny, is taking that journey with them and kind of being along for the ride as activities grow and change. So it's the best answer I can give to that.
Yeah. What does the blank process look like before something is identified and tested? Are you trying to recreate a bugs list, or do you just kind of play unconventionally? Is there some other insight onto how you guys do that? I'm fascinated to learn how actually one goes about doing QA.
Yeah, so this is sort of a massive question, so I'm gonna give it a duly massive answer. I spent a lot of time thinking about how to answer this question. So basically, just to lead off, the short answer is yes. Both of those, like any sort of agile software QA process, there are a lot of standard user stories and test cases that get reused every single time a new activity is, sort of put together, is stood up. So, we know all of the common stuff that can go wrong. We always cover the bases, in terms of like making a 3D action MMO looter shooter. Like there's a lot of standard things that we have to check every single time. So we also have a ton of great tools for testing, which are getting better and better over time as technology advances. We're always getting better too then at spotting things like out of environment issues, missing physics, and other common game design problems that you encounter in the early phases of any video game or any software, right? In terms of playing unconventionally, in the testing world or in the QA world, we would call that ad hoc or exploratory testing. And the version of that I think most people who maybe aren't in those worlds would think of, just go play and try weird stuff, is actually generally a really small part of what testing involves. And that's because rather than doing things randomly, there's only so many of us and only so many hours in any given workday to get things done, and any given release cycle to get things done. So we do a lot of directed brainstorming around activity-specific concerns, and then we generate new user stories, new test cases around those concerns. What could go wrong for this specific thing? What are the concerns that we have around what players might try for this specific thing, rather than just sort of like goofing around. So just some basic examples that I can give you of stuff that we thought about for deep dives and leading into the exotic mission, and then into the exotic mission as well. Can we use Strand to go too fast, bypass a trigger, break the activity? Does grapple make carry objects, of which there are more than a few in deep dives, and then hence kind of along the path to that exotic mission, does it make those trivial? Or is having to use your grenade to grapple and be able to get those done faster, is that a fair trade-off for the potential loss in lethality? And you have to keep in mind too that Strand, at the point that we are first testing this activity, is still pretty new even internally to the test team. We haven't had years of the entire community making cracked builds, so we're working really hard to get ahead of the learning curve, and to make those cracked builds internally. And that's part of the fun of testing right there, is getting our hands on that stuff. We're also thinking about things like what happens if we kill all the enemies extremely fast. Wiping the floor too fast can cause weird stuff to happen. Sometimes it can, especially if there are objectives that are triggering from clearing a wave. If we wipe everything in 10 seconds, like, does that objective trigger properly? Or, is there something else that it's waiting on and then we get hung up? What happens if we use Telesto? Just in case.
It's a good question. Yeah.
You said the name. Oh my gosh, it's over.
I did.
Oh no! Everybody, check your recordings real quick.
Yeah. Yes. Yeah. Don't joke about that one, Lego. Come on now.
So I mentioned before, we kind of briefly touched on, kind of some of the things that we looked at in deep dives in the exotic mission. And so I and a lot of the other testers spent a lot of time looking at out of environment escapes. Like how can we break through the walls? Are there places where physics are missing? Can we bypass these doors? Can we skip down a level? And then we've got those ocean barriers, right? Where you're passing through, and then you've got the effect on you. So, the weapon's down and your movements, gets a little funky as you're floating. And so, we were throwing every movement ability and movement glitch in the book, everything that's ever been done to crack movement and break through walls at those barriers, just to see what would happen and to make sure that they were behaving appropriately. And they did not behave appropriately for a while, but that's part of the process, right? With doing something new like that, and of course we also just spent a lot of time just griefing each other by stealing all the bubbles. And I think that did get changed, so everybody has their own bubbles. Thank goodness. You're welcome.
Yeah.
I had the perfect route down to hit every bubble first. I spent so much time running those traversals. You have no idea how well I know them. But so that's kind of I think the broad sort of view of like, how do we approach an activity like this?
Yeah. I'm curious with, you talked about recreating bugs lists or just playing in unconventional ways for testing things. I was curious, how much fun is a factor in QA? Is it all just bugs, or is how satisfying a feature is to use a part of the feedback loop while testing?
Fun's a huge factor, right? I mentioned we're all about the memes. So, it is in reality a huge part of the QA process. It's one of those things that's always in the back of our heads, even when we're specifically looking for bugs or executing other tests.
Right.
There are also a lot of open play tests internally that are specifically centered around getting feedback from folks in the company that haven't played the feature before, or at least that haven't played it as much as those of us who are assigned to the feature and directly hitting it every single day. So yeah, fun and satisfaction are always in our minds. We also have a lot of fun along the way, just fire teaming up, cracking jokes, griefing each other. It's you got to keep it fresh, right? You got to keep things light. Working on a video game, and it should be something that is fun for the end user. And so if it's not fun to go into that playtest, then then that's a concern.
That's awesome that y'all have people go in on other people's set. That sounds like such an awesome approach to everything. That sounds really cool and makes me want to be a part of it.
Yeah, I want to shout out Fishing Fridays just as being a great way to relax on a Friday afternoon.
Fishing Fridays, that's awesome.
I like this insight.
If you know, you know.
What's your version control like? I mean, what are your struggles? Maybe even the biggest struggle that you face with version control while you're doing QA.
So version control is very rigorous, as it has to be with a game as complex as this. In the test side, we get daily change lists that keep us informed about what's new or recently fixed. Right, I kind of mentioned before, this version in Destiny is the way I look at it. And that's often a guide for us for what to check on that day, what to watch out for. We're always double checking to see if a pesky old bug has returned, if a fix for a new bug has unintended consequences. That's called regression testing. Again, for those who maybe are more in the software development field, probably be familiar with that. So that regression testing and that kind of thing is a really big deal, as it is with all software development. The hardest thing about test work in general is being able to stay highly mentally engaged while performing highly repetitive tasks, right? This isn't like just going in and grinding a seasonal activity mindlessly and eating Cheetos and watching Twitch or YouTube. And, no, you actually have to be focused and paying attention the whole time. And so this is true no matter what you're testing, right? And so this is something that we think about, and we counter it by working in fire teams so we can kind of help keep each other on the ball. We switch up fire teams. We periodically switch up what features we're working on. We also like to drop into play tests for other features and just see what else is going on. And that just kind of keeps things fresh and keeps things exciting. So I guess that would be my answer.
Yeah. That's really cool. I'm obviously not in this industry. I don't know a lot of what these terms mean, so I appreciate the explanation there, Kit.
You know, I'm all about the vocabulary lessons.
Oh. Speaking of vocabulary here, what do the test scripts / procedures look like? Do you guys have QA people that specialize in breaking stuff? I know you've sort of already answered that question to an extent, but how much time do you guys spend on balance testing versus feature / bug fix testing?
So honestly, I think they would look extremely familiar to anyone doing any kind of software QA. Generally, we've got a set of steps, a general intent, maybe a note on any specific setup for the character or the account, and then you just execute on that. When it comes to breaking stuff, we'll generally be operating more freeform than that. So usually we'll brainstorm various possible player actions and then make a list or a matrix and then go in and try them each one by one, documenting as we go. There are often spreadsheets involved in more complex scenarios, so I love that. In terms of specialization, everyone on the team brings a different perspective and a different skill set, but we're all specialized in trying to break stuff. It's just not always the same stuff. It's hard to explain how many different things can go wrong and do go wrong during the testing process that players never see. I think one of the earlier questions was, where can we see your work? And I'm like, you see all that stuff that works? Did you notice all the times it didn't break, you didn't fall through the floor? It's hard for me to point at things that I contributed to, right? Because they don't exist.
I like that.
And that's in a way why all the folks on QA are kind of unsung heroes in that regard, in my mind. Looking for outright bugs is generally, though, our top priority, especially in seasonal activity testing that I'm primarily working on. That's because, the design team is often trying new things, combining familiar mechanics in new ways. And the first and most important thing to do is make sure that it's playable and people are not getting progression blocked or booted to orbit or just crashing the game. So that's always the starting point. PvE balance is often something that is dialed in along the way based on the activity's goals. We talked about this earlier with some of those more sandbox-oriented questions. And then that balance gets a much stronger focus once the activity reaches a stable state where big sweeping changes aren't happening. Design also, of course, has a lot of data and feedback from past activities that they can use to level set when making a new activity. So that is, of course, a big help. And then, on the test side, we get that info too. Ultimately, though, I said this before, balance is a subjective thing. And, we know it's never going to be perfect for everyone. So the aim is always to hit as close to the target for each activity as possible, and then to learn and improve. I feel like we did a great job with deep dives and Wicked Implement. And I'm excited to keep working on that kind of stuff.
I'm excited to see what you do next. I can't wait. And maybe we'll be, I don't know, I can't say this. I was going to say, maybe we can pull something out of Merc here in a second to see what's next with weapon tuning. But we are going to switch gears here into weapon tuning, and I am excited to see the answers to some of these questions. First up, how do you handle tuning weapons that have a standard and an adept version when the effectiveness is drastically different between the two?
This is a really good question. I think that this question was triggered. I made a comment on Destiny the game the other day, kind of addressing you guys balance based on usage stuff, and we provided a little chart that shows one of the data points that we use for balancing in PvE called kills over expected, right? And the chart that I had shared was a high skill lobby chart, because we can actually break out the meta by skill levels in PvP, right? We can do it by playlist, by date, by ammo type, by weapon slot. There's a whole bunch of different filters that we can have. So imagine if the Destiny tracker, meta tracker that shows that top 100 list, imagine if it was a graph and you could filter it by literally everything, every option that exists in the game, right? And that's what our data provides to us, right? And someone correctly pointed out, and I want to give them credit, they correctly pointed out, you guys said that the Immortal Adept is overperforming, but the standard Immortal's effectiveness is way negative, right? And so what's interesting is that when we make adept weapons, like the goal of an adept weapon is that it should be like, maybe 5-10% better than like the standard version, right? And what that means is like, oh, if you don't get the perfect roll you want with the magazine and the barrel, you can make up for it with an adept mod, or you can make up for it with the adept masterwork and give yourself a couple of extra stats, right? So like it might turn a 4 out of 5 adept is equivalent to a 5 out of 5 standard, right? But the goal isn't really to like massively separate those two weapons and have one that's just like flat out better than the other. I think we've actually hit that goal pretty well so far. There are a lot of players who will tell you that like if you've got your God roll standard version, like the adept isn't going to be that much better than it, right? And there are some differences where like certain adept mods have a huge effect on the performance of the weapon and stuff like that. But in the case of most adept weapons, the actual biggest difference in effectiveness comes because the average skill of the players who are using the adept version of the weapon is much, much higher than the average skill of the players who are using the standard version of the weapon. So the effectiveness split that you're seeing is actually more the players than it is the weapons, right? That being said, that chart that I used that showed Immortal at negative effectiveness, that was the high skill chart. So what that's actually showing you is the people who are using the standard Immortal, those players are high skill compared to the rest of the player base. But when you isolate them into just high skill lobbies, they are on the low skill version, like the low skill edge of those high skill lobbies, right? So if I had showed the chart that was the entire skill curve all at once, the standard version of the Immortal is actually like right on the line for kills over expected at like 0%, right? And then the adept version of the Immortal is even higher elevated. And then when we look at those, what we do is we add those two together into a single dot, and we kind of graph that out on the far edge, right? So when you do that, it actually like exacerbates the difference of like how effective Immortal is, because the standard version again is like flat at 0 and the adept version is like way up, right? So again, part of that is that the skill level of the players who are using the adept is higher in general, right? But that is countered by the fact that as usage increases, not everyone who's using the guns is high skill. And so as usage increases, you expect the kills over expected to be dragged down because people see like, oh, everybody good's using the Immortal, I'm going to go use the Immortal. And when lower skilled players potentially are using the Immortal as well, and they're still performing above their skill level, right? Then that's when you know that like the gun is a little bit too hot. Now, at this exact point in time, Immortal's actually not really that bad comparatively. And we're going to talk about this a little bit later with some stats and data and stuff like that. And that's why for the most recent past, we hit target lock specifically and kind of shifted all the resilience levels up that target lock is effective against. And in addition, we've obviously got the range and zoom tuning, which we'll also talk about in a little bit. That's coming in season 22, which hits Immortal and SMGs kind of hard. So yeah, I mean, it's like not a super satisfactory answer, but it's like we don't really try to tune them any differently. We try to treat them like they're one gun, but it is interesting when you can split the guns out like that and you can see the average skill of the players using each one, and you're like, oh man, like people using the adept guns are usually pretty good.
Yeah, it's like two layers of things going on there whenever you look at the charts. And I'm glad you pointed out the minuscule differences between the two guns sometimes, because in my mind as a fusion rifle player, a lot of times I'm thinking of the adept charge time mod and what that can do versus any other charge time effect on a fusion rifle. But the difference is so minimal that it's not in the long run. It's just better players are using the adept versions a lot of times. So that's an interesting statistic there.
Well, the adepts are harder to get, right? So it makes sense that more dedicated, not even necessarily more skill, but more dedicated players are going to have a wider selection of adepts than they are the standard. And players who maybe they're not as easily able to acquire adepts, like they're not going to have as many options to choose from that gun, so they'll probably use the better roll on the standard version. So
the next question is there any chance they will tune former lightweight hand cannons either back to lightweights or adjust stats to reflect adaptive archetypes? They seem to really underperform Waking Vigil as an example.
So we actually did tune the lightweight hand cans that became adaptives. We tuned those up in February of 2022. It was actually in a TWAB and like a patch note and everything that we bumped their stats up. But I think the bigger issue here is like we have to look at the weapon source when we decide how cracked we want the stats to be, right? And like Waking Vigil is just a destination weapon. It's not like a raid weapon or a dungeon weapon or something that's getting reprised. And so if it were, the Dreaming Cities, if it were Last Wishes raid weapons and like we had changed the hand cannon and it was now like horrendously outclassed in terms of stats, like we'd probably be more amenable to going through and doing a second pass and like bringing it up a little bit more. But we can't have every single weapon from every single source competing with, for example, like Rose or Exalted Truth. Yeah. Right? Like we have to have some weapons that come from some sources that are just a little bit better in some ways. And so unfortunately, it seems like some of the 150s that are like really, really old that have come back recently have just like, fallen a little bit victim to that. But it'd be interesting to hear what you guys think about that.
Yeah. I feel like the thing that you said at the very end kind of seals it for me. It's like because you need different weapons to be better than one or the other just because of where their source comes from, like that makes a lot of sense to me that you would pay careful attention to those ones and make those ones worth grinding out for, whereas like a reprise something or a weapon that isn't in a just a destination weapon like you were saying. Or even a recent example that I can think of is the auto rifle from the Vanguard Strikes this season. It had like its aim assist is like just so low because it was from a season where just it was competing at the time and it doesn't really compete, but y'all jacked it up with the perks. Like there's amazing perks on the thing. And so there's this give and take where even if the stats aren't there, y'all are paying attention to the perks. And then if it's not, then it's just probably not from a destination, or the source of it isn't that hard to acquire. So it doesn't need to be the end all be all or better perform something that's from a more difficult activity.
Yeah, if y'all look at like our foundry weapons and our world drop weapons, like every once in a while there'll be like one that sneaks in there that has like some really just like wacky stat line that's like super good or something like that. Like Redback, for example, actually is one that like the range stat on it is just like really cracked for like a world drop weapon. But generally it's not like that. Like generally the super easy to acquire weapons that are kind of just like given out to anyone. Like the easier a weapon is to acquire, like the less cracked its stat packages are going to be. But what's kind of fun about that is that if a weapon has like a not super great stat package, you can put some like insane rolls on it perk wise sometimes. I'm not saying we always do that, but there have been times where like, we've made a weapon and it's like an old reprise and the stats aren't great. And I was like, let's just throw some funky stuff on here. Cause like, it's probably not going to be super meta because like the stats aren't that great, but like we can do some weird combinations on this thing now because like we could try some stuff.
I'm feeling it with some of these weapons this season. It's good stuff. I'm still, my grind is still on. I still have stuff to go get because the perk pulls are very large, and for good reason, pretty large on some of those. I do have to say, Merc, speaking of lightweights, and you mentioned Redback, I know it's not a hand cannon, but you have a love for it. Are there any new lightweights we have to potentially look forward to in the future?
Yeah, I actually built myself a lightweight sidearm. Well, I built it for everyone.
What?
But I built myself a lightweight sidearm in season 22. That is, well, I mean, you'll see when it comes out, so it doesn't really matter anyways, but I don't want to spoil too much about it. But yeah, I built myself a lightweight sidearm in season 22 that was like in the vein of Redback, but I wanted to do some different stuff with the perk rolls on it, and I'm really liking it. That has been my go-to in our PvP playtests. So
I feel there's a new favorite weapon of mine going to be released soon. That's what I'm feeling right now.
Nobody seems to want to use lightweights, and I'm totally fine with that because I'm enjoying it. I think I'm going to hit like 3,500 PvP kills on my Redback here soon. So.
You're talking about it. I feel like I've talked about it for the past 6 months on this show. I hope some more people pick it up. But, if they don't, I'll run around the map faster and have a better average time to kill value than other people. That's fine. Yeah. I'm cool with that. Yeah. So, next up, do you feel like optimal TTKs are where you want them to be in the current sandbox, or would adjusting them one way or the other benefit the current Crucible sandbox? I think and this is pulled from one of the community questions. They think the main thing they're curious about right now is what is the design intent fulfillment for TTKs to be as low as they are. They don't want year one high, but I feel like us being able to take some weapons down half a second and some even faster than that is a bit much for them.
Well, there's a little bit of hyperbole there, and that like there really aren't a ton of weapons that can kill in a half second, and if they are, it's because they're damage boosted basically. Yeah. So like 120 hand cans on the 2-tap, Teraba with Ravenous Beast up, adaptive pulse rifles on low resilience or with a damage boost, right? But like there's actually not a ton of weapons that are killing in less than a half second, and that's a very intentional design choice. We feel that under a half second, you start getting into time to kill windows where people have legitimately no time to react to what's happening, and it makes the gameplay very odd. We think that times to kill they probably err a little on the fast side right now. I don't think that we would be necessarily opposed to like shifting some of the stuff that's like creeping to 0.6 back a little bit, right? But at the same time, we kind of need faster TTKs because we've got high-ish special weapon availability in PvP, right? We have a lot of instant kills. In order to deal with instant kills, your primary weapons need to be able to kill pretty fast too. If they can't, then we have to reduce the prevalence of special weapons and one-hit kills in PvP. And then in addition to that, we also have a lot of abilities that are happening right now. We have abilities that increase damage resistance, that increase your HP. We have abilities that heal you. And so because of those things, we also need weapons, primary weapons that can put out a lot of damage pretty quickly, because if they don't, then those abilities can get out of hand. And then the third thing is our movement speeds are very fast. And because our movement speeds are so fast, if your primary weapons don't kill fast enough, people can escape from engagements very easily. And you end up with a frustrating, situation of the correct answer if you get shot first is just to run away, right? And that doesn't make for a very fun combat loop either, right? So that being said, we have something coming in season 22 for PvP called Checkmate. And Checkmate is a very interesting take on PvP where we have made some modifications. And it is not like D2 Year 1, but we have shifted TTKs just a bit. And we have modified ability cooldowns by a pretty significant bit. And so I'm not going to share too much information on it, but I will say that like right now in our sandbox, our TTKs for primary weapons are between 0.6 seconds and 1.0 seconds. In Checkmate, they're between 0.8 seconds and 1.2 seconds. And hand cannon TTKs did not change.
Oh, wow. Okay, I think you've got some people intrigued who are listening right now. I'm very excited to play this. And along those lines, you talked about hand cannon time to kill. Another question here is, what is the baseline to determine, yes, this weapon is perfectly balanced and every adjustment to others should trend towards this, because they know that many dedicated PvP players, that baseline should be 140 hand cannons.
So people may be surprised to learn that we actually also consider it to be 140 hand cannons, right? And I'm not saying that we will always consider it to be 140 hand cannons or that we have always considered it to be 140 hand cannons. But in the current meta, at the current point in time, we look at 140 hand cannons, and specifically we look at Ace of Spades and we look at Rose, right? And so when we look at those two guns, we kind of draw a line on that kills over expected chart. And anything that is above those, right, there's like a slope that gets drawn on the top edge of that chart, right? And as you move right along the chart and your usage goes up, we want that slope to start coming down to approach zero, right? And so anything that is like past those weapons and above them in effectiveness while also being above them in usage, that's a good indication to us that those things need to be tuned down. And so you can see that that's kind of what we're doing with our balancing decisions. Graviton Lance got buffed. It was a good buff. The gun got very good, a little bit too good. We pretty quickly turned around and we're in the process of bringing that back down. No Time to Explain, for example, we've hit 3 times repeatedly. It also got affected by the pulse rifle aim assist nerf, so we're tuning No Time to Explain back down. Immortal on the same thing, tuning that back down. Right now, we do have to be careful because that level changes based on the type of lobbies that we're looking at, right? And so when I'm saying that, I'm looking at high skill lobbies. If we were to go to all of the lobbies, all of the skills, we'd see some really funky stuff that's way more effective than those. Like, for example, like Centrifuge right now is like super effective in like the middle of the bell curve, right? And like that's super cool. That's super neat, right? But when we go to the high skill, we see Centrifuge like falls way down in effectiveness comparatively, you know? So that's something we'll talk about in a little bit, but it's interesting the balances that these primary weapons work out kind of between each other. At the different parts in our game's population and the different styles that they're playing. Like if you hop into, you know, a low skill game, the meta that they have is very different than the meta at the high end of the skill spectrum. And that's something that, we haven't necessarily been able to see before, but now that we've got skill-based matchmaking on a couple of the core playlists, and we have a competitive mode that now has, rank-based matchmaking whenever you're within a window of your skill. I think it's one major up or down. It just purely uses your rank to match, right?
Yeah.
Which is pretty cool. I think we talked about that in a TWAB last week. So now we can see that, like, we can really hone in and we can be like, all right, at like ascendant rank comp matches, like, how is this shaking out? And so we've been able to like really hone in, and we've been able to do a little bit more like top down balancing than we had in the past, where we kind of balance just for like the experience of the majority of players. And now we're really able to see like, well, at 10,000 rank ascendant games, like, this is a problem or this isn't a problem or something like that. Right. So
Right.
it's like Jotun, right? Like Jotun is ridiculous in some lobbies. And then once you hit a certain point, it just like disappears.
That's a perfect example. I wish that I could see those charts for the different like levels of skill, because there's no way as a player for us to know that, only y'all know that. But it would be so fascinating to see all the different weapons that are in like the top 10 for the lower brackets or the middle brackets versus the high tier. And just for learning purposes too, even mastery of the middle tier, what the high tier is using. I think that's fascinating.
Well, I'll talk about it a little bit more when we dive into like the actual meta discussion later. I've got some notes that are specifically focused around like the high skill area, right? Because I want to talk about that, because there's some perception and reality stuff here that's going on, that a lot of these questions that we got were very like perception based. And I want to make sure that we're just all on the same page. And like, I know that it is impossible for y'all to look at the data the way we do. So like, that's why I included that in the TWID, that I put that chart in there, right? Like I do want to be able to share the data with y'all, so that you can see why we're making the decisions that we're making.
I'm so glad you put that chart in. When you did put that chart in, that was one of the first ones that I commented on. I don't remember where I was on a podcast at the time, but I was like, I'm so glad this chart is here. I didn't know you put it up at the time, but it was like, oh, this is the kind of data that I want to see as a player, to show me how y'all are looking at things, because it's so hard from the player's perspective to see those things. So I'm glad to have you here talking about it now.
Yeah, and I wish that I had clarified like more, like leaned more into like, this is separate from like the main chart that we use, right? So like we look at the main chart first, and we see if anything is an outlier there, and then we like go to the high skill chart and we see if it's still an outlier there. And if it's an outlier in both places, then like that's a pretty good indicator that it's it's too strong, because that means that it's overperforming on the whole of the bell curve and also at the higher end, right?
Right.
So that's like, I wish I had clarified that more, because I think it led to some confusion. I saw some comments on Reddit where people were like, it doesn't make sense that you're nerfing certain things, they're not overperforming here necessarily. And it was like, well, they're still performing pretty darn great comparatively.
Just depends on what chart you're looking at. Okay, so next question here. We've been talking about balancing and time to kill levels, and I'm curious, as a player, is there a common resilience level that you balance weapons for? Many weapons seem to use resil checks to keep them in their place. Immortal's one that I think of with target lock that was a big deal recently. Is there a go-to resil number that y'all are balancing for?
So we consider base resilience to be 60, which is 192 HP on the player. Technically, it's like 122 shields and 70 health, right? Because you always have 70 health, and then your shield is actually what scales.
Yeah.
So we consider 60 to be baseline, right? So that's like where the sandbox is centered around. And for resiliency checks, if it is a forgiveness check, we generally don't really care where the forgiveness check lies on the resiliency, tier. And we look at it like it's just kind of a bonus that if your resiliency goes over that, someone else is going to have a harder time killing you. For time to kill checks, which is different, if it dramatically decreases the time to kill, we want that to be at a low resilience, right? Like you can think of adaptive pulse rifles right now, where I think it's like 2 resilience is their resiliency check, right? Because that time to kill drops sharply. And so we don't want people to feel like they're really struggling to avoid being too bursted by adaptive pulse rifles. But at the same time, we want to give adaptive pulse rifles, if someone's not paying attention and someone's running 2 resilience, the ability to get, a little bit of an advantage over that, or in this case, a lot of an advantage. If it is a time to kill increase that is like a little bit more slight, and it pushes them kind of from meta to out of meta, like we want that to be at like the higher end, right? So like 8, 9, 10 resilience. So if it's something like taking the TTK from like a 0.8 to a 0.9, we would want that to be higher up, right? Because because if it's too low, then that gun's just bad because everybody is probably going to hit that resilience check, right? So those are kind of the two edges that we use, is like if it's going to push a gun out of the meta to increase their TTK, it's got to be at a high resilience, or we'd prefer it to be at a high resilience. If it's going to make a gun super, super strong, it's got to be at a low resilience. And then again, 60 is kind of the center point for us.
Right. Okay. Good to know. And does that include like damage stacking? Like it, because there's just a lot of damage stacking stuff out there now. You got Radiant, you got Surges, and there's a lot of weapons that kind of start to break once you start adding stuff together, like high impact reserve sniper rifles with a 3-time surge or Radiant, those kind of things, and there's different resilience checks in there. I'm guessing you want to keep those pretty high as well.
Yeah, so when we change damage on a weapon, we run checks at 10%, 15%, 20%, 25% damage above it to see how it changes it.
Cool. Yeah.
Generally, for things that offer like 25% or higher, like the requirements for those are kind of stronger, so we're more amenable to it doing like crazy things to the TTK and dropping it a lot, right? For 10%, we generally do not want 10% to do anything significant to the TTK, right? So most weapons where they're at, a 10% buff is enough to make them more forgiving, but it should not do anything dramatic to the time to kill. A couple of exceptions in the weapons that aren't really strong. Again, adaptive pulse rifles are one we've talked about, where a 10% buff does a lot to them because it steps their resiliency threshold up at which they can 2-burst, but it requires a lot of precision. Mm-hmm. The other ones, like 15 and 20%, were a little bit more nebulous on. And it depends a lot on the activator and how difficult the activator is, and also how dramatic the shift is in time to kill, right? So for example, if there's something like Golden Tricorn, which is a moderately easy first activator, and it gives you like a 15% damage bonus, if that does like a huge jump on a gun, we're like probably not going to put Golden Tricorn on that gun, because like a single kill, just a single kill with no other thing, doesn't have to be precision, doesn't have to be a reload, doesn't have to be specific, like that's one of the easier activators for PvP. And so we would want to probably try to avoid that, right? But if it is like multi-stacking, like you're stacking 2 separate damage perks, then we're like a lot more lenient. The one exception that I personally can talk about is that gut shot straight is kind of locked in where it is on hand cannons, because if it goes up by even a point, I think it will allow you to 3 body shot with a 140 hand cannon if you're radiant. Right. And so you could literally kill without hitting any crits in the optimal TTK if you were radiant. And we were like, we cannot do that. So yeah, like that's one thing where like gut shot straight is kind of like slept on, even though we just buffed it a little bit. But like the damage increase that you get to the body is like extremely high, and it can do it can make guns really, really forgiving comparatively. If you can just hit body shots at that point in time. So it's pretty funny, but that was one of the ones that we specifically looked at and we were like, ooh, like probably not going to do that, you know?
Well, I'm excited for that buff to come. Very excited. Plus the bow stuff you mentioned earlier. You talked about lightweight bows at the beginning of towards the beginning of the podcast with the PvE stuff, and I'm excited for those changes as well. Okay, next up. What metrics do you use to determine what is the strongest in PvP?
So we've talked about this before, but we have like kind of a bunch of metrics that we use, right? And there's not just one overall thing where we're like, if this is the highest, then it is the strongest, right? Because it doesn't necessarily work that way. If we were to use just kills over expected, for example, Sweet Business is the strongest gun in PvP, right? And like Sweet Business is pretty strong, but I don't know that it's necessarily the strongest gun in PvP. It's just the people who build into it and use it are very good with it.
Oh, that's crazy.
So there's some stuff like that. We use a bunch of different things. We've mentioned it before, right? Like we use community feedback that's coming to us. We use playtest data, playtest feedback that we're giving in our own playtest. We use our own personal experiences when we go in and we play trials and we run into something a lot. Like triple behemoth titans or something, right? Like we run into these things ourselves when we're playing the game. And then we also use data. And I know that people, in particular, there was one question I think we cut out that was like, why do you balance everything based on usage? And it was like, usage is a tool that we use when we are balancing, but it is far from the only tool. And in fact, it is like one of the lower tools comparatively, but it is something that you look at because usage is the thing that is most visible to players, right? They can very easily see usage on Trials Report or on Destiny Tracker or something like that. And usage is also a reflection of how much you run into something. And we've talked about, something we use called net fun, which is how much fun is the person who's using the gun having, and how little fun is the person who's being killed by the gun having, right? And we use that to balance as well. And net fun is not like a linear thing. It ratchets down exponentially as the number of times you experience something increases, right? I think I used Cloud Strike as the example, which was pretty freaking prescient because at the time when I used that, it wasn't super common. And now here we are, and it's like a top 3 gun in Trials, right? And now it's annoying, right? Like back then it was like kind of a niche thing. It's like, oh, this dude's using Cloud Strike. Like that's kind of funny. And now you're like, I literally hate Cloud Strike and I want nothing more than to not be killed by that stupid lightning thing again, right? Like it gets to that very, very quickly when usage hits a certain point, right? Yeah. And the secondary thing is when the usage is really low on a gun, the performance of the gun is wildly variable because you could have really, really highly skilled players who are using that gun who perform exceptionally well with it in niche builds, right? And so they can boost the kills over expected way up. But if more people start using that gun and the average skill of the user comes down, the performance comes down along with it. And if it doesn't come down enough, then we know that it actually is the gun that's making things too strong. So that's why we kind of look at all of those stats as a whole. But the one that I talked about in the TWID and the one that I like a lot is kills over expected because it does graph things out in a nice, easy to see slope. And it makes it really easy to draw a line and be like, wow, this thing sees more usage than this other thing, and yet the effectiveness is way higher than it. Like that's probably not great, right? Either this thing needs a buff or this thing needs a nerf.
Yeah. Well, with all of that, do you feel that hand cannons have been power crept in the Crucible?
So that's an interesting question. It's kind of a leading question. And what I would like to point out is that we keep track of all the changes that we made in like a historical document, right? So like we can actually see where guns were, a year ago compared to where they are today, right?
Yeah.
So in terms of actual stuff that has power crept hand cannons, it's the Immortal and it's Graviton Lance.
Yeah.
Those are the two things that have actually actively been buffed up and like surpassed hand cannons, right? When you look at the other stuff that we've buffed over the last year, high impact scout rifles got a base damage buff of 2, right? Auto rifles have been pretty substantially buffed, but outside of the center of the bell curve, I don't think auto rifles are really treading on hand cannons, just yet. We'll see how season 22 goes when they get the range increases that they do. But hand cannons are also coming out of that very nice as well, right? Pulse rifles, we nerfed low handling. We nerfed their range twice. We nerfed their aim assist once. The only buffs that pulse rifles have got are we increased lightweight damage by 1, and we increased adaptive precision damage by 1. We've also nerfed no time to explain 3 times, and at one point in time we buffed high handling only, right? So I don't know that either adaptives or lightweights are what I consider meta right now. Hand cannons have not been nerfed at all in the last year, and slightly more. The only change is we buffed 180 hand cannons, right? SMGs have been nerfed a lot. We have nerfed SMG range twice. We have nerfed their base damage on lightweights. We nerfed Ikelos directly. We nerfed aggressive base damage, both their base and precision damage at that point in time. We nerfed Immortal. Then we nerfed Target Lock, which is basically because of SMGs, right? And the only buff we've given to SMGs is adaptives. Got increased precision damage. And we increased precision damage. We increased base damage on precisions by 1, but we also nerfed Shieras at the same time, right?
Yeah.
Sidearms did get an aim assist fall off buff, but I don't think sidearms are really super meta right now. And Forerunner wasn't affected by that, right? So power creep, I don't really think that they've been power crept, right? When you look at the receipts, I don't really think that they've been power crept. I think what has happened is that we are experiencing a lot more of high skill players matching against each other with increased frequency. And people are playing their lives super, super hard.
Yeah.
And people are taking, PvP games a little bit more seriously than they may have in the past, trying a little bit harder to win. And pulse rifles kind of mesh well with that playstyle. And so we've seen pulse rifle usage come up, even though technically most pulse rifles are weaker now than they were a year ago. Right. So I think it's kind of similar to what we talked about in PvE with like the delta increases. And then so weapons feel different. I kind of feel like the state of PvP has changed a little bit. And because the state of PvP has changed, certain weapons have kind of moved and they're tier lists. Now, that being said, I have some data from the last 2 weeks of high skill lobbies.
Okay.
And so what I have is I took the top 10 most effective primary weapons, and I got those from the top 25 most used primary weapons, because the top 25 weapons based on usage account for about 70% of all kills, right? If you take the top 50 weapons, it's about 80% of all kills. If you take the top 100 weapons, it's like 97% of all kills, right? So just for my own sake, for taking notes, I use the top 25 weapons, but I have a couple of stats from the top 50. So out of the top 25 weapons, the most effective weapon in high skill over the last 2 weeks has been spare rations. Right? 5 of the top 10 most effective weapons were hand cannons. Spare rations, ace of spades, round robin, rose, and hawkmoon.
Dang. Yeah.
Right? The adept immortal is at number 7 for most effective weapons in high skill. Now it is also the highest usage, right? But it is number 7. So it is not the highest usage and also the most effective, which is something I want to clarify. I've said, a fair amount now that like currently one of Immortal's biggest sins is high usage. Like that is why it is at the forefront of people's minds. That's why they don't like it. When you look at it historically, it's probably not even in the top 10 for like most unbalanced primaries we've ever had. At one point in time, we had Hard Light getting 30% of all weapon kills by itself. Right?
Yeah.
And there was a period of time, I think either it was right at the beginning of the 120 hand cannon meta or like right before it, where hand cannons alone had more kills than every other primary weapon combined in PvP.
Yeah.
Right. And if you added Fellwinters to that, they had more kills than every other weapon in PvP. Like just hand cannons and Fellwinters had more kills than every other weapon in PvP combined. Right. So like we have gone through some really, really unbalanced periods of time, right? And so I think recency bias is coming up a little bit, where like someone said in one of these questions, like Immortal is oppressive in nature and has wildly high usage. And I was like, I'm pretty sure even if you look at Destiny Tracker, it's only like 0.5% above Ace of Spades right now.
Yeah.
In terms of usage, right? So even if we were just looking at usage, it's not even outbanned in usage, right? But I also use the example of DMT, where a DMT had less than half the usage of Immortal and was getting the same amount of kills on a week-to-week basis, right? So like that's, when you want to talk about wildly oppressive or like overperformance, like we have had that before and we're not quite there right
I
now.
do wonder if, a lot of that sentiment comes from what you were talking about earlier with one, like we talked about Immortal and Graviton being at the top of some of these lists, the only ones that have power crept. And because like Immortal is a legendary weapon that you see a lot of, that one SMG that stands out in the crowd of SMGs, that is the oppressive nature of it. Maybe not necessarily the effectiveness of it or even the popularity of it compared to like fusion rifles, which you see kind of all different types of right now, or just some of the other archetypes out there that are more in line with each other, to where you see multiple different versions of it and you're not just getting killed by the same name over and over again. Because as you said, getting killed by that same name over and over again is what causes people to feel oppressed, and the fun factor to go down, take that dive bomb that you described.
Yeah, it's definitely a facet of it, right? Like we'll talk about this with fusions in a little bit, but if you look at the top 25 primary weapons in comp, 9 of them are actually hand cannons. So cumulatively, hand cannons actually see pretty high usage, just below pulse rifles. And on top of that, cumulatively, they're also the most effective class of primary weapon. But because it's spread out amongst a bunch of different weapons, basically, you don't see the same weapon over and over and over and over again. And so it doesn't cement itself in your memory. And it's especially bad with like weapons like Immortal that have like a very specific sound when they fire, right? You hear it all the time, just like Lorenz Driver for a period, right? Like you hear it all the time and it's super frustrating. And like, it's really, really bothersome, right? But when you're getting killed by 9 different hand cannons, it doesn't embed itself in your brain in quite the same way, right? And so when you look at the top 25 weapons, we've got 9 hand cannons, 6 pulse rifles, 3 SMGs, which is the Immortal and the Immortal Adept. And then we've got, and also Ikelos is still up there as well. We've got 2 scout rifles and Jade Rabbit and Wicked Implement. Wicked Implement being up there is a product of something that happens every single season when we release a new exotic primary. It will always, without fail, doesn't matter what it is, a new exotic primary that we release will pop up very high in the charts very early on because everybody's using it. And especially high skill players use it a lot because they're trying to see if they can fit it into their builds and they're trying to see if it's something good that they can use. And then that falls down over the course of the next 2 to 3 months. And usually by the next season, it's like pretty equaled out, right? Like Centrifuge was at like a very concerning level right after it released. You know, Revision 0, I like the first 2 days, I was like, am I going to have to nerf Revision 0? Right. And like now, of course, no, obviously not. We haven't done anything to it, you know? So it's like that. It happens every single time. It's something we know and we expect. Wicked Implement is like moving its way down. I think it's still a fine scout rifle, but I don't know that it's necessarily going to be meta and high skill comp. But we also have 1 sidearm and we've got 1 bow, right? So there's actually a pretty decent mix of weapons in that top 25 for primaries as far as it goes. And when you look at the top 50, it's the same thing. 17 hand cannons, 12 pulse rifles, 3 SMGs, 5 ARs, 6 scouts, 3 sidearms, and a bow, right? Like that's a pretty decent representation up there. And I think we've said before that like we feel on Weapons Team that the best primary meta is kind of hand cannons and pulse rifles at the top, you know, hand cannons at the top, pulse rifles right underneath. And then autos, SMGs, kind of scouts below that because we don't really want a scout meta. We don't really want an AR meta. So we that's kind of where we're at, you know, and it might take a while for that perception to line up with reality. It kind of trails a little bit, right? It takes a while for people to start noticing that. And this is not me to say like, oh, Immortal's totally fine where it is right now, because we don't think that. But in season 22, we have another set of changes that are coming that kind of directly affect Immortal in terms of nerfing its, you know, zoom with rangefinder, and they directly affect Shiura's, which Shiura's is actually the more effective SMG, by the way. Like, I don't know if people have been trying it out, you know, since the reticle changes and stuff. But if you haven't, you should give it a shot, because I think Shiura's is actually, data-wise, and also in my personal opinion, the better SMG than Immortal, right? Harder to acquire, you know, can't currently get an Adept, which probably hurts it, but if you've got one, it's pretty darn good.
Yeah, Shiura's with Harmony, I've been digging that a lot. I have been bouncing forth with Harmony with Cascade Point weapons, using the new stuff with the old. So yes, Shiura's has been pretty hot. Been loving it for sure.
Definitely. Got one question here. Can we get a meta shift to underperforming weapons? This person would love to see 180 hand cannon / 360 RPM auto meta and glaives be the close range special meta. What are your thoughts on that?
Ooh, glaives.
So careful what you wish for, right? Because all of those weapons are getting a buff of some sort or another. 180 hand cannons are benefiting significantly from the increase to range that hand cannons in general are getting. And 360 autos that are not already at like 19 or 20 zoom are also getting a huge glow up from the range changes, right? I don't think we're going to see like a 180 hand cannon meta or a 360 auto meta, because 360 autos can already hit like 40. Well, now in season 22, they'll be able to hit 40 meters pretty easily, which means they can compete with hand cannons and pulse rifles. And in order for an auto rifle to be competitive at the highest tier of skill, right, that means it has to be able to compete with people who can peek shoot, you know? In order for it to compete with people who can peek shoot, it has to either kill really fast, like we saw in the 600 auto meta, where they were killing in 0.7 seconds, or everything else has to be very bad. And I don't think we want to nerf everything else, and I definitely don't want to make auto rifles kill that fast again. So we're probably going to try to avoid that, although I do believe they're going to be quite good and quite usable. I don't know that they will necessarily be meta, but we would like them to have a place in the meta, but not necessarily define the meta. if that makes sense, right? 180 handkins is the same thing. There was actually another question I don't know if we're gonna have time to get to, but I can kind of answer it in this. 180 handkins are very hard to tune, because the problem with high damage, slow rate of fire weapons is they really only have one or two options for how fast or slow they can kill. And for 180 hand cannons, it's either 0.67 seconds, which is among the fastest in the entire sandbox, and we've been there before with Luna's Howl and Not Forgotten, or it is 1.0 seconds, which is among the slowest in the sandbox, right? And there's really no in between. And some people have mentioned, well, you guys can just tune the rate of fire. And rate of fire, you will probably notice, is something that we very rarely ever touch, because rate of fire of guns has a huge effect on how weapons feel. Even a single frame difference, like if you're playing on 30 FPS, which I know most people don't, but the game is 30 ticks, so we talk about it like that, right? If you are playing at 30 FPS, a single frame is the difference between like a 600, an adaptive auto rifle, and a 450 precision. And those two guns feel very different, and that's only a single frame of difference in rate of fire, right? So that, and talk about a 600 and adaptive auto rifle to a 720, which is a rapid fire. That's not even one frame of difference. That's alternating one frame every other shot, right? So it's a half frame of difference, and they feel that different, right? So we have to be really, really careful tuning rate of fire, because it can make a gun feel super bad or super powerful very quickly with a very small change, right? And so that's why we usually only do it on perks that are short term. Because then if you don't like it, it's not permanent, So 180 hand cannons will get better. 360 autos will get better. I do not think that you want glaives to be the close.
I don't think so either. I'll throw that in there.
Yeah. In season 23, glaives are getting a pretty substantial overhaul to how they work. We mentioned some stuff in the TWID the other day. We've increased their projectile speed pretty substantially. This is like somewhat new information, and it's not locked in stone, so don't take it as such. But we've looked at allowing the shield charge to passively regen at a slow rate when you have it in your hands. So when the glaive's actually in your hands, not backpacked, allowing the shield to recharge slowly so that you can utilize the shield more often. We have looked at rebalancing the shield's damage resistance in PvP to account for the increased uptime and make sure that it doesn't become oppressive and stuff like that. We've looked at reducing the delay after you fire before you can melee, because right now there's like a 3/4 of a second delay where you shoot a projectile and you can't melee afterwards. You're actually locked out. So we've looked at reducing that. We've done huge balance passes on the exotic glaives with the aim of making them feel a lot better to use and just in general be a lot better. But we definitely don't want glaives to be the close range meta. If glaives are significantly outperforming shotguns or fusion rifles, that is probably not going to be a super fun experience to play in. So we're being very careful with how we tune them to make sure that they feel better to use, but they don't feel bad to play against.
So you threw out a whole bunch of stuff that sounded really awesome for glaives just now. None of those things are like those are just things that you tried out or are being tried out. You're not. I was trying to get a feel for like, are these things possibilities for the coming seasons, or like the passive shield regen on glaives that you just mentioned?
I mean, everything's a possibility. We're going to play test it, and we're going to see how it feels in playtest. And I think all the stuff that was just mentioned would just be straight buffs in PvE.
Right.
Like, I don't think that there's any downside to that. Which is good. Like, we would love for glaives to kind of find their home in PvE and feel useful in in-game content.
Yeah, cool. That's exciting stuff. And we'll see. But yeah, I'm glad to hear Bungie of devs saying we don't want a glaive meta. I think a lot of people will be glad to hear that for PvP. Next up, how do you feel about fusion rifles' place in the Crucible at the moment? And along with that, I'm so curious about the zoom changes. Is it going to put fusions more in line with how zoom works on other weapons, or will it change how damage fall off distance relates to zoom only?
So I think at the high end, fusions are too strong in PvP. I think in large part that's due to a couple of perks, and we're going to be taking passes at addressing them. Fusions are one of the rare archetypes where they are like almost perfectly balanced across the subfamilies.
Yeah.
Right. Like, there is a near equivalent use and effectiveness of rapid fires, adaptives, precisions, and high impacts, which is really, really rare in this game. So like they're balanced very well against each other. And also, we're fortunate at this point in time that their usage has come down a lot from where it was. So they're significantly less, you run into them less frequently, right? They can still be frustrating, especially with like, Antaeus Titans and Iterative Loop and stuff like that. But I think that in Season 22, we're going to nerf Under Pressure. So we're going to reduce the effective accuracy that is granted by that, because that is like the S tier perk on fusion rifles, right? Like that is the perk that everyone is using on fusion rifles, and that gives them a huge bonus in effectiveness. It makes them so much better than they would be at base, and it's pretty out of band for a perk that basically has 100% uptime in PvP, right? And then in a future season, maybe season 23, maybe season 22 mid-season, we're also going to take a look at Kickstart as well, and probably bring that down a little bit, because I think those two are kind of combining to surface a lot of the more effective than we'd like play with fusions. Now, the zoom stuff is interesting in how it works with fusions, because fusions currently in live right now have a special modifier on them that reduces all of the effects of zoom. So it gets reduced by, I want to say, about 40% right now. So damage fall off, aim assist fall off, accuracy, recoil reduction, it reduces all of those things by about 40%. It reduces the benefit of those things by 40%, I should say, because that's what zoom does. When you increase your zoom, you increase your accuracy, reduce your recoil, push out your aim assist and damage fall off. In season 22, it will no longer push out damage fall off. That part has been removed. This gave us an opportunity to go back in and kind of revisit a lot of the custom tuning that we had done to weapons to get around these problems. And so we actually stripped out that like zoom effect reduction that was in there. So they will be getting the full effects of accuracy and aim assist fall off and recoil reduction. The range level that we have put them at is slightly lower than where they're at right now in live. So it's like it's a very small damage fall off nerf, a buff in the other things. That is what led to us reducing Under Pressure. And so what you will find is that in season 22, a fusion rifle with Under Pressure will feel worse than it does right now, but any fusion rifle that does not have Under Pressure will feel better than it does right now. So that's kind of we're kind of squeezing those two things together a little bit. So we're bringing down how effective fusions can be at the top edge, but we're also lifting up some of the fusions that kind of didn't get a lot of play because they couldn't roll under pressure, right?
Man, if you would have just hit me with the under pressure information without the other half, all the fusion rifle players of me doing this podcast would be like, Lego, what are you doing bringing this information to us? But no, so we got both sides of it here, and it's cool that y'all are reducing the range a little bit too, like the overall, I guess that's damage fall off range you're referring to. On the fusion rifles overall, but they're still getting better benefits from zoom now, and all the benefits that come from it. So that is so interesting, and I am very excited to try out my Burden of Guilt that has never relied on Under Pressure.
Yeah, it's not a huge damage fall off nerf. It will be larger for weapons that had abnormal zoom values. Because even though the effective zoom was reduced, they were still getting it. So things like Glacioclasm, Cartesian Coordinate, anything that was like relying on having higher than standard zoom, this will be like a more significant nerf for them.
Wow, big stuff. Okay, will Cloud Stripe be looked at, or is it in an acceptable spot?
Yeah, in season 22, we are reducing the radius around the player who gets headshot that is lethal, right? I think right now it's like 5.5 meters or something like that, which is like pretty absurd. That's like melee distance, right? So we're reducing it down to, it's like a little over 3 meters, like 3.25 meters, kind of depending on your resilience, where it will still kill you and where it won't. So it's a pretty substantial reduction in the proximity kind of splash that you can take from it. So it will still be able to kill you, but you will have to have been much closer to the person who got headshot for it to do that.
I have one potentially last question. We might do a follow-up here. I'll kind of ask if there's anything else you want to share before we go, but I was curious, with balancing legendary weapons, do you individually tune weapons with stats outside of the listed stats we see in game? Like, for example, if there's two weapons in the same archetype that have the same exact range, stability, aim assist, handling, and recoil direction, are there other stats in the background that make each legendary weapon feel different?
So there are some times, but it is not something we do. And in fact, like Ikelos was one that had it and we removed that, right? So we don't really want there to be an invisible stat in the background that like makes one weapon better than the other, because then it kind of invalidates a lot of the stats that we surface to you as a player in terms of how you judge your stuff. So I'm not saying it never happens, but we don't do that intentionally anymore. When we build weapons, we want you to be able to do a head-to-head comparison of the two stat-wise and see which one is better. Now, that being said, we do custom stuff on the sights, like the optics, the scopes, right? A lot of times, if those are unique, those are made by hand. And so like the depth of field, or how big the sight is, or how small the sight is, or how it blurs, or stuff like that, like all of that, all the scope stuff, the sight picture is made by hand, and that's all custom tuned. So there is still a difference in how a weapon feels to ADS and shoot it, but it's not such a thing that should specifically be affecting performance, right? It kind of is just like, you know, Kutch and I used to talk about this. He hated Bygones, right? Like couldn't stand Bygones. I loved it. It was one of my favorite guns ever. He didn't like the sight picture, you know? So it's stuff like that. Like those are the things that we allow to differentiate weapons. Yeah. Some weapons, people don't like the way they feel when they ADS. And some weapons, people love it, right? You know, like I'm a huge fan of Suros hand cannons, and other people have been like, I don't really like Suros hand cannons, you know? And it's kind of just a feel thing of how it feels when you're ADS.
Yeah, so there's still hope for Zealot's Reward potentially just having some space magic in it. I can still hope that there's something going on there.
I mean, I can investigate it if you want, but if I find it and it's better than other guns,
then it's going. Maybe I should hold. No,
Like, you got to keep your mouth shut, man. Don't do this to yourself.
I'm sorry.
You saw what happened to Ikelos, right? So
the curse of knowledge, right there.
Do I need to file a bug report?
No.
No,
Yeah.
What have I done?
Zealot's Reward feels too good to Lego. We have to figure out what's going on with it and make it feel worse. But this was actually something that just happened with targeted redaction. Like it was using the wrong recoil pattern, right? And so different subfamilies. So archetype means hand cannon, pulse rifle, auto rifle. Subfamily means rapid fire, adaptive, precision, stuff like that, right? So different subfamilies can have different recoil patterns, right? So what targeted redaction was doing is it was using the wrong recoil pattern, and that was unintentionally making it feel better than other aggressive hand cannons. And so that was something that we had to address, because like that's an invisible thing that like there'd be no way that you could know that as a player, and it was just better than all the other guns, right?
That's so interesting.
Now exotics, all bets are off. You can do anything you want to exotics. A lot of exotics have some really spooky custom tuning in them to make them feel a certain way. So
I think this is about the end of our time here. Is there anything else either of you would like to share before you go? Maybe even, you talked about exotics.
Ask the Bose question.
Okay, I'll ask the Bose question.
I've been telling the Bow guys I would address it, and I've gone like 3 straight podcasts without addressing it. So
all right. So what are the plans for Bose coming in season 22?
So we had the same issue with sidearms a while back, where we actually don't like check a box that says like hit scan on a projectile. What we do is we set the velocity of a projectile above a certain amount, and if it travels a certain distance within a frame, it translates that projectile into hit scan, right? And when we made bows a while back, we didn't have people quite running the game at the speeds that they're running it right now, at the distances that they're running it, at the performance levels. And so bow projectiles velocity was set maybe like a little bit lower than it probably should have been. And what that's led to is, as people's rigs have gotten better and stuff like that, that calculation that it tries to run to determine whether or not a projectile should be hit scan was saying that like, no, this shouldn't be hit scan. And so it was making bows be actual true projectiles at longer ranges, which for precisions wasn't really so bad because they had a higher base velocity than lightweights did. But for lightweights, it was really bad. And so that's part of the reason why lightweights have felt so not great at longer ranges. Their hit registration just feels really weird, right? And so what we've done is we increased the projectile of the precision bows to a much higher level, so that it basically like they should be hit scan almost the entire way, right? And then we have matched lightweight projectiles to precisions. So it's a huge increase and velocity for lightweight bow projectiles, which means that they should have a very similar hit scan or very similar hit registration properties to precisions moving forward. And then in addition to that, a savvy community member or a team of community members has pointed out that bow reload perks stop working above a certain value and they no longer provide any benefit. And we investigated it and we found out that there is a lock on the animation that was preventing it from playing any faster. And so we dropped that lock way down so that now even once you hit maximum reload, if you apply scalers and stuff to it, it will still reload faster up to a certain point. So
this is gonna be good. I'm glad we asked that question. That is very exciting for me as a lightweight bow lover, just in general. And I know there's a lot of people that have talked about that reload issue too. So man, there's a lot there. All right. I think this might be the end, y'all. Is there anything else? Any other words either of you would like to say before we head out?
It's crazy that it's coming to an end. And not only is it crazy that it's coming to an end, but it's crazy that both Kutcha and I are looking at it from the other side as listeners and as guests. Like, I don't think if you had told me 7 years ago when I was recording with a Rosetta Stone headset on and trying to figure out everything in my power to make our audio quality not be legitimately horrible, which took me pretty much until like I feel like 6 months before we stopped doing the show, or I stopped doing the show, is when I finally figured it out. But if you had told me that we would end up where we are right now with 300 episodes of the show out there, with tens of thousands of listeners, with, you know, us, like, the show's a big reason why both of us are working at Bungie, I think. I mean, it's crazy. And I mean, the only thing I can say is, like, is that not like the dream, right? Someone with no video game experience at all made a podcast with a buddy and talked about weapons for years. And now I'm designing and working on the same weapons that I talked about for a long time. I mean,
yeah, it's a wild twist to, 5-6 years ago, be arguing on Reddit with people about like how zoom works on fusion rifles. And now I'm actually like professionally testing the game instead of just doing it in my spare time for kicks. It's weird. It's weird how things work out sometimes. I would never have like foreseen, I think, this turn of events taking place, and it's been wild. Thank you both for having us back for this, this opportunity to talk again, and thank you to everybody tuning in and playing for making this whole ride what it's been.
Yeah, none of this would have happened if it wasn't for everyone who listened to the show and everyone who supported us and the community that's been built up around this show. And I mean, we struck out getting you guys to run, getting Impetus and St. Kabir and Court to run PvE. Like, I don't even know how we did that. I feel like just messaged you guys on Twitter and on Discord, and we're like, hey, we're thinking about starting up a PvE podcast. Are you guys interested? And it turns out that it's like one of the greatest freaking podcasts out there. The other day, I was listening to it. I was like, God, their audio quality is so good. I was like, how is their audio quality so much better than ours is? And like, we've been doing this for so long and they're so good. It's so professional. I was like, this show is freaking, you guys are going to be, leagues above where we ever got to. And, Lego, for you and Tony to come on kind of out of nowhere and just take over a show with both of its main hosts gone and totally turn it into your own thing. And I think just make it a super awesome show, and so many people enjoyed it. We had new people coming in. Every once in a while I just look at the reviews and stuff, and I'm like, man, these people never even listened to the show when Kutch and I were on it. They just found it when you guys were on it. They just think it's like this great show that came out of nowhere, and it's like, man, it's so cool to see that stuff happen. And it's sad to to say that this is the end, but it's the end of one journey and hopefully the beginning of a new one.
Well, I do want to say thank you all to both of y'all for all of that, and for me personally, just being on the show for the time that I was, and can echo what Kit and Merc were saying as well. Thank you to everybody who's listened just over the past few years, all the sponsors, all the patrons. We said every week the show wouldn't happen without you, but we did truly mean it. So thank you for listening. And you know, that brings us to the close of this final episode of Destiny Massive Breakdown, but it's not really the end. We've got Impetus here, and you can find him on the new flagship DMB show, Podcast versus Enemies, with his co-hosts for everything PvE. And you can find me, Lego LaFlash, over on YouTube, of course, doing reviews. And then you got the original hosts, Kit and Merc, on Beneath Twin Suns, the Star Wars podcast. So you can always still hear their voices there. You all know where to find us. So if you want to hear more about those, check out on social media, the Discord, Destiny Massive Breakdowns, the description of this episode. But from all of us, thank you for joining us for this very special episode of Destiny Massive Breakdowns.
Later,
Peace.
everyone.
See ya.